Okay, so we're going to be talking about the 2019 FRQs. This is kind of a series we're going to go through. I'm going to publish one video at a time, and it's going to be a problem at a time. We're going to just kind of run through each one of these problems. Today, we're going to be talking about number one, which is a nice one. It's easy. It's quantitative variables describing distributions. This is really common to have for number one. I could see them definitely including this in the AP Stat exam this year. This could be brought in with a lot of other complicated things, right? You can talk about this with t-tests, with confidence intervals. I could see them kind of bringing all this together. You have to describe something and kind of bring it together. So we're going to kind of run through this relatively quickly. This is a really easy question, so I'm not going to bore you with all the details of it. So we're just going to go through it and, pay attention, ask questions. If you haven't done this, take the time, pause the video, you do it yourself, because I think everybody can probably do this one really easily. The question is, can you get all the details right? Could you get that 4, or are you going to be stuck at the 3? I'm going to run through it, and you check your answers and kind of go through it from here. So the first thing we have is a histogram that is talking about the square room size in square feet. The first thing it says is describe the distribution. Well, describing distribution requires 3 things: shape, center, spread, and any unusual features. So 4 things really. There are some definitely things I need to talk about. The first thing you notice is that this is a relatively bimodal distribution. So you've got this big peak here with a valley in the middle and another peak there, right? So that's a pretty big gap. So this is where you would really kind of talk about definitely bimodal. The first thing I said was the room size is a bimodal shape with a gap between 200 and 250. So that would be my shape. I also talked about peaks between 150 and 200 and 250 to 300. That part of it, and when you read through, I'm going to attach the actual key too. So when you read through that, that's really not a requirement. I did talk about the range, and I just used the basic definition of range. Went from 100 all the way up to 350. And so I just basically said that. Center, I did talk about center, even though it's bimodal. I'm still going to talk about the centers. I did reference the modes, 150 to 200 and 250 to 300. I went ahead and said the center of the distribution falls somewhere between 200 and 250, although there is a gap at that location. And in this case, I don't really seem to see there's any outliers present. To get this fully correct, there's a few things I needed to make sure I did. Number one, for part A, I needed to make sure that I talk about shape. And I could have said a couple things. I could have said it's bimodal. I could have said that there are 2 peaks or that there are 2 clusters. As long as I said one of those 2 things, then I would have gotten shape correct. Number 2, I needed to talk about the center. This is between 200 and 300 square feet. In this example, getting the center right, you could have said that was between 150 and 200, and another one between 200 and 300 definitely satisfies that component. I did talk about the 2 peaks as the centers. I also talked about the gap in the middle as being the center. If you got any other responses, check the answer key just to make sure that your answer isn't too far off. They gave quite a few options there just to see in terms of like what was required to get the center correct. And so that shape, that center, that spread, and the other part of this was you had to talk about spread in terms of range. I said it was between 100 and 350, so I gave the whole range. You could have talked about some smaller ranges from 150 to 250, or the interquartile range was between 50 and 150. You had to pick one of those those measures of spread to kind of get the full measure of it all. The fourth thing, was you had to put things in context. And for me, I said the room size is a bimodal shape. I also talked about at the bottom where it says the center of the room size is between. So I'm using the word room size. I'm using the variable name at some point in the description. That's really all you had to do. So you had to do the shape, center, spread, and make sure it was in context. Okay. Let's go on to the next part. Part B, there's a couple of things here. The first part, it gives you, the Part B question is here, but in Part A, it gives you the information there. I went ahead and copied that over onto the second page so you guys could see that while I'm talking about it. Part B wanted to know if there were outliers. Just determine whether there are outliers and use the following to sketch a box plot. And so in order to get full credit for this question, you had to calculate the upper and lower limits, the fences, and you had to tell me if there were outliers or not. Now for me, I wrote the formula down. All right, you can see that here. Then I went ahead and I wrote down the actual equation, and then I worked that out to get my lower limit, and I got my upper limit at the same time, right? So I'm using those numbers, and then I made a statement about whether that satisfied that requirement as being outliers or not. And how do I know that, right? I need to connect the two things that I'm talking about. And so I said, because the room sizes fall within the boundaries, there are no outliers. You had to do 3 things in this to get full credit. Number 1, you had to compute the upper and lower boundaries. If you used only the formula parts of it, then you had to give me the actual limit. If you did that and you didn't kind of show your work to get the other parts, you're good. But if you just used the formula and didn't give the actual upper and lower bounds, you're not going to get credit for that part. The second part, you had to make a correct decision regarding your outliers. Did you have an outlier or not? Right? Why? The third part was you had to connect that back to your fences. If you did the two things, made a correct decision saying that there were no outliers, and told me why you knew there were no outliers, then you've got the right answer. Okay? Part C, this part was, they kind of lumped this in. This is section 3, so they lumped the box plot and part C all together as one piece. Okay, so first part in part C was to actually get the correct box plot. If your box plot looks something similar to mine, then you are going to get full credit. I had to make sure to put the box and whiskers, the median values. In this case, there were no outliers, so I didn't have to mark any outliers out there. And the numbers had to be approximate. You can see the numbers there at the bottom where I showed you which ones were relevant. The second part of part C was to talk about what the box plot didn't show, but the histogram did show. And in this example, you could see the histogram made that double. You have a gap and a bimodal shape in the histogram, but in the box plot, you didn't. The box plot actually showed it was mostly symmetric or ever so slightly skewed to the left. But in order to get credit for this part, I had to make sure to talk about that the histogram showed a bimodal shape and the box plot didn't. As long as I did that, I graphed the box plot correctly, I'm going to get full credit for part C. Okay, of course, there's a lot of different options for what score you're going to get. Obviously, if you got all 3 parts correct, you're going to get a 4 on this example. If you missed one part where you got 1 P and amongst all of those things, then you would have gotten a 3, and then it breaks on down from there. I'll include that in the attachment. I'll put that on there along with this document too, so you can check your answers along with the actual AP Stat scoring guidelines. I hope this one went really well for you. This was a really good example of how to bring back shape center spread and how to describe quantitative graphs and all those things together. So if you got questions, please email me, and I'll talk to you next time.